Morning YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Sunday, 26th of July, getting ready for the Outsiders. First Moondog will be a separate broadcast.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not.
Thanks, Barry. It is indeed time for Outsiders. This morning's guests are Nick Cater, Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre, Esther Anatolitis, is Director of Regional Arts Victoria, and Paula Matthewson is a weekly columnist at The Drum. So, Bill Shorten put his leadership on the line by announcing 2 days out from the ALP's national conference that he wanted Labor to adopt a turn-back policy on asylum seeker boats.
I want to see us do our fair share to help the problem of refugees, help the challenge that people face, but I also think that we've got an obligation to make sure that people are safe.
Paula Matthewson, Bill Shorten argues that is now arguing that the more humanitarian course is to turn back the boats and to double our refugee intake. Is that convincing?
Is it convincing?
More humanitarian?
No, not at all. I think anybody who has an understanding of the issues at play here would understanding that this is not necessarily more humanitarian, but more electorally palatable. This is about ensuring that the Abbott government can't criticise or accuse Labor of being weak on asylum seekers, and it's purely that, nothing else.
Well, let's hear what Peter Dutton, Minister for Immigration and Border Protection, has to say.
Bill Shorten can't hold a position in relation to turnbacks for 12 hours. How is he going to hold it for 12 months in the run-up to the next election? And how on earth would he implement it in government when his government would be firmly split right down the middle on turnbacks? We know that his Deputy Prime Minister, in Tanya Plibersek, is fiercely against turnbacks. We know that in the run-up to the 2007 election, Kevin Rudd promised these same weak words. He said that they would adopt turnbacks, and yet when in government, 50,000 people arrived on 800 boats and 1,200 people drowned at sea when Labor was last in power. Now, it's clear to me that Mr Shorten doesn't have the ability to unite his party in a way that Tony Abbott has to stop the boats.
So, Nick Cater, is Labor unelectable at the next federal election if it doesn't adopt turning back boats to Indonesia as policy?
Well, I think that we had a very clear verdict at the last election in 2013 about how people felt about this issue, and that they felt that we wanted a controlled and managed immigration program, including a program that includes a large humanitarian intake. I mean, it's often forgotten that we are amongst the 3 top countries in the world for intake for our humanitarian program, and arguably, I think, close to the largest per capita intake of humanitarian refugees. Many countries don't even have that category. So we do have a very generous policy, and Bill Shorten, I think, will have warmed a lot of hearts amongst Labor by saying that we should make it even larger, and there is an argument for that too. But, I have to disagree with Paula. I mean, clearly the only humanitarian solution to this very, very difficult problem is to stop the boats setting out. The Christmas Island tragedy changed the morality of this issue for most people, and I'm frankly quite surprised that it's still being debated.
Well, Esther Anatolitis, is it evidence of a party that's going to sacrifice its principles for votes, or the greater humanitarian solution?
Oh, look, it is disappointing to hear it talked about so much as the political expediency of it. I'm going to agree and disagree with something that Nick and Paula have said. There hasn't been a clear electoral outcome in Australia for a good few years on anything at all. And the more the parties polarised their positions and pandered to a mass market media who are increasingly anxious about their market share and happy to keep polarising even further, the more we're going to get further and further from an appropriately humanitarian position. I agree with Nick that preventing boats from leaving in the first place would be a very interesting approach, not turning the boats back, but actually working with international partners to address global issues that create asylum-seeking problems in the first place. That's where we should be focused. And then we certainly should not be turning people back, that is, in breach of our international obligations.
Paula, is there another course to take between turning boats back or not? You know, say, for example, not turning boats back, which is maybe not great for our relationship with Indonesia, but when one does arrive, fly those on it straight back to an offshore processing centre, say in Malaysia.
Well, I think that's probably one of the options that are being considered at the moment. But I mean, Anthony Albanese from the Labor left, who voted with the motion to change the Labor Party platform on boat turnbacks, has been saying this morning that that Labor's policy is really about preventing the boats from leaving the shore at all. So it's not really a matter of having to make the choice to turn the boats back. And I think that's probably an unrealistic ambition to have when we do have the asylum seekers, but we also have economic refugees. And I'm not sure that what the Labor Party is talking about will necessarily address that component, the economic refugees. So look, let's see what the debate brings us when we come to the election. But really, at the end of the day, it's not just about media pandering. This is not just about selling newspapers. This is about the fact that we have a vast majority of the Australian population who, for whatever reason, are supportive of harsh, very harsh action against asylum seekers, and you know, that has to be taken into consideration. A party has to take that into consideration if they want to be elected to government to make the changes that they want to do. They can't just say, oh, well, we're going to take the morally pure way to go, because that will leave them in opposition.
Well, Nick, Bill Shorten is now walking a tightrope between keeping the left and right factions in his party happy. Is he going to be able to do that successfully for the next 12 months?
Look, I think this is the dilemma. This is the problem for parties of the left in much of the Western world. You see the same in Britain at the moment, where you know, there's a tension in the election of a new leader between the sort of intellectual left, if you like, and the old, more blue collar left. That's exactly the same divide that you see here, and you see it to some extent in America too. But this is impossible. I think it's impossible to please both sides on these key touchstone issues. You know, it's impossible to have a position, say, on climate change that satisfies both the left and what we call the left and the right of the party, although I think I prefer to characterise it slightly differently. It's difficult to have a policy on asylum seekers that will please both sides, because these are issues not of degree but absolute, and that is the problem for Bill Shorten. He's not alone, and I think Labor's problem is to think that this is particular leaders that is the problem with the party. It's not. It's something deep in the fact that they have two core constituencies now, the largest and most vocal of which is really the educated middle class intellectual sector of it. And the smaller one, increasingly marginalised, is the socially conservative blue collar working class vote.
Another big opposition announcement from this week is the pledge around climate change.
But we will see a great future for renewable energy in this country. Less pollution, more jobs, and downward pressure on electricity prices.
Esther, what do you make of the two Labor policy shifts here, you know, taken together? The opposition matches the government on boat turnbacks, but goes the other way on renewable energy.
Well, it's absolutely crucial that we have some leadership on renewable energy and taking climate change seriously. So that's very welcome. It's interesting. It seems like either some really serious internal chin scratching and reflection has happened, or some very, very seriously statistically compelling polling and phone calling has been happening, because the shifts are pretty stark. But it's welcome, it's necessary, and it's a position that is clearly going to distinguish Labor from the coalition at the next election.
Paula, asylum seeker policy is divisive and controversial, but so is climate change.
Sure, but I think if you look at the electoral palatability of the two positions that Bill Shorten has been successful with this weekend, both of them are vote winners at the end of the day. So boat turnbacks are a vote winner, and renewables are a vote winner. Even though the community is kind of divided on climate action, they love renewable energy, particularly because it reduces their electricity costs. So I think we need to remember that's the driver, that people love renewables because it's saving them money, not necessarily because it's saving the planet.
Nick Cater, how do you see those two opposing policy shifts?
I have to disagree completely with Paula on that question of renewables. Look, on this issue, I think the one thing you can't accuse Bill Shorten of doing is going with a small target strategy. You know, to go to the next election with arguing for a price on carbon, having lost the last election in quite a considerable part on that issue. I mean, he might as well put a T-shirt on saying "Kick me, Tony Abbott." You know, this is really putting himself out there. It's a very brave decision, but one that'll be very, very hard, I think, to convince the electorate. I mean, you've got to convince the electorate they got it wrong last time, haven't you, over this? Now, I agree with Paula in the sense that people, you know, there is a groundswell there for renewables, you know, insofar as people like having solar panels on their roofs that they get subsidies for. But I disagree with her completely on this question of cost. I mean, you just can't say that renewable energy is cheaper. And I'll give you just one example. You know, in the ACT, where they want to go 100% renewable by, I think, within 10 years, they're paying $160 a megawatt hour for solar from a solar plant that's been built just to the south of Canberra. They're paying $90 to $100 for wind that's coming all the way from South Australia. And that's 3 times what you would buy conventional electricity using coal power for. So it's not least cost emissions. And this is not a question of whether you want to reduce emissions or not. It's a question of the most efficient, cost-effective way of doing it. You could, for instance, go to gas from coal and get a much, much bigger reduction for much less cost. So I think the 50% is a problem. He hasn't costed it. He hasn't told us there's no modelling to show us what the flow-on effects will be, what the effects will be to electricity prices. Whether or not they're subsidised, that money still has to come out of the public's purse. So I think that this is a problem policy for him, and it'll become more of a problem the closer they get to the election, the more people look at it.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to call a halt to part 1 here. I don't know whether there's going to be a first dog this week or not. We shall see.